Stand in almost any backyard today and look at what is actually growing. A rectangle of mown grass, a few pots by the door, maybe a tomato plant bought in May and half forgotten by August. It is tidy, it is pleasant, and it would have looked to your grandparents almost unbearably empty, because 50 years ago the yard behind an ordinary house was not decoration. It was a working larder, a pharmacy, and a place the whole family drifted toward on a summer evening. Every foot of it earned its keep, and it was crowded with plants that most people alive today have never once tasted. By the time this is over, you will know 10 of them. 10 plants that grew in nearly every backyard half a century ago and have quietly slipped out of almost all of them since, so completely that most people under 50 would not recognize them at the market, let alone grow them. Some of them fed families through the winter. Some of them scented an entire street when they flowered. And one of them, the plant number one, was so common that it shaded the back step of house after house down every road, and is now so rare that if you offered its fruit to a child today, they would not know what it was. I will come back to that one. Keep it in the back of your mind as we count down, because it holds the real answer to a question this whole list keeps circling. That question is simple and a little haunting. How did all of these disappear at almost the same time? These were not delicate plants that needed a specialist. They were the easy ones, the ones that came back on their own year after year, the ones a busy family could ignore for weeks and still harvest by the basketful. They did not vanish because they were hard. Something else happened quietly in one single generation, and by the time anyone noticed, the plants were gone, and so was the knowledge of what to do with them. Before we begin, notice something about your own memory. Most people cannot name more than 2 or 3 of the plants on this list, and yet almost everyone past a certain age carries a fragment of them anyway. A color glimpsed over a fence, a texture underfoot, the particular quiet of a garden in the hour before dinner. These plants shaped the childhoods of an entire generation and then left so gently that no one held a funeral. There was no last one. There was no headline the morning the final backyard arbor came down. They simply thinned out year upon year, until a normal thing became a rare thing, and a rare thing became a forgotten thing, and the whole slow change happened so quietly that the people living through it never once felt it happening. That is how the most important losses usually arrive. Not with a bang, but with a garden that is a little emptier each spring, until one day you look out and the yard is only grass. So this is not really a list about gardening. It is a list about what a backyard used to be and what we let it become. You may find that you remember more of these than you expect. A smell from a grandmother's kitchen, a stain on your fingers, a bush you were told to stay away from because of the thorns. If that happens, sit with it because that memory is the point. Let us start the countdown gently, at number 10, with a plant that children used to eat straight off the vine and almost no one plants on purpose anymore. At number 10, the nasturtium. If you grew up before a certain year, you may remember them tumbling over a low wall or spilling out of an old tin bath in the corner of the yard, those round flat leaves and those hot orange and yellow flowers that seemed to glow. What most people have forgotten is that they were not there to be admired. They were there to be eaten. The leaves have a sharp peppery bite, like watercress with a temper, and the flowers were tucked into summer salads or handed to children as a small dare. You could eat the whole thing, and children did, pulling a bloom off the vine and biting the sweet base where the nectar gathered. They asked for nothing. You scattered a few of the big wrinkled seeds into poor dry soil, the soil where nothing else wanted to grow, and by midsummer that forgotten corner was on fire with color. They seated themselves and came back the next year without a single thing being asked of you. And here is the quiet irony. In an age when people spend money on supplements for exactly the kind of vitamin C those peppery leaves are full of, we pulled up the plant that gave it away for nothing and replaced it with a bag of bark chips. And there is a small memory almost everyone of a certain age shares without realizing it is the same memory. A grandmother pointing at the bright flowers and saying, "Go on, you can eat that one," and the strange thrill of a child being told that a flower was food, that the garden was not just to look at but to taste, that the line between the pretty and the edible was thinner and friendlier than anyone had let on. That single moment taught a generation something we have quietly stopped teaching, that the world immediately around you is generous, that food does not only come sealed in plastic from a shelf, that you can reach out into your own small patch of ground and be fed. A child who learns that early carries a different relationship with the earth for the rest of their life. A child who never learns it grows up believing that food is something you can only buy. At number 9, something stranger and even more forgotten, the Jerusalem artichoke. It is not from Jerusalem and it is not an artichoke, which tells you something about how little we remember it. It is a tall plant, taller than a person by late summer, with small sunflowers at the top, and under the ground it makes knobbly tubers you dig up after the first frost. Families grew them because they were nearly impossible to kill, and because they fed you in the hungry gap of winter, roasted or dropped into a soup that turned silky and sweet in a way potatoes never quite managed. There is a small scene that belongs to this plant, and you may have lived it. A cold, bright morning after the first frost has knocked the tall stems down, and someone goes out with a fork and turns over the soil, and up come these pale, knobbly tubers, muddy and strange, more of them than anyone expected, as if the ground had been quietly hoarding a treasure all summer. That surprise, that sense of the earth giving back far more than you put in, was one of the ordinary pleasures of a productive garden, and it is a pleasure most people now go their whole lives without feeling even once. We buy our vegetables already washed and counted and priced. We have never dug a supper out of the cold ground with our own hands and felt the small astonishment of abundance. Ask yourself when you last saw one in a garden. Almost never, and there is a reason people half joke about. They spread. Leave one small tuber in the ground and you have a patch again next year, whether you wanted it or not. To your grandparents in a yard meant to feed people, a plant that refused to leave was not a nuisance. It was a promise. Somewhere along the way, we started wanting our gardens to obey us, to stay small and quiet and controllable, and the plants that insisted on giving more than we asked for were the first ones we dug out. That instinct, to prefer the plant that behaves over the plant that provides, runs through everything else on this list. Hold on to it, because at number 8 it turns almost fierce. There was a plant that grew by the back fence of half the houses on the street, and people planted it once and then spent the next 40 years trying to contain it. Number 8 is horseradish. If you have only ever met it as a pale scoop in a jar beside the Sunday roast, you have never really met it at all. In the old yards it was a living thing with broad, coarse leaves, shoved into the worst corner on purpose, the damp, shady strip along the fence where nothing pretty would grow. And there it stayed, decade after decade, outliving the people who planted it. The magic was underground, in the root. On a cold afternoon, someone would go out with a fork, lift a length of that thick, pale root, and bring it into the kitchen, and within minutes the whole room would announce what was happening. Grating fresh horseradish is an experience nobody forgets. It clears your sinuses from across the room, it makes your eyes stream, and it fills the house with a heat so sharp it feels less like a smell and more like a warning. And then it went into a little pot with some vinegar and cream, and it transformed a plain plate of beef into something people remembered. Why did it go? Partly because we stopped cooking the meals it belonged to, the slow Sunday joint that pulled a family around one table. Partly because the jar exists, and the jar is easy, and the jar never makes you cry into a grater. But something was lost in that trade, and it is the same thing lost all through this countdown. The jarred version is a flavor. The plant in the ground was an event. It marked the season, it demanded a little courage, and it connected the meal on the table to the soil 20 feet from the door. When you buy the heat in a jar, you get the taste and you lose the ceremony, and the ceremony was half of what made it worth doing. There's a particular memory that comes with horseradish, and it usually involves an older relative and a look of grim delight. Someone who grew up in one of those houses will tell you about a grandfather who grated it himself at the kitchen table, eyes watering, half laughing, refusing all offers of help, insisting that the shop stuff was for people who had given up. It was a small performance, a bit of theater that happened a few times a winter, and it fixed that person and that plant together in memory forever. Food used to come with people attached to it. A jar has no grandfather in it. When we traded the root in the ground for the product on the shelf, we did not only lose a flavor, we lost the person who made it, and the small ceremony that carried them into the next generation's memory. Think for a moment about how many of the strong, insistent, characterful things have quietly left our lives this way, replaced by something smoother and more convenient, and just a little bit emptier. Horseradish is only the loudest example. It refused to be tamed, it refused to be subtle, and it refused to leave, and for that a whole generation planted it with respect. We inherited the fence it grew along and dug it out to make room for nothing in particular. At number 7, the losses get sweeter and a little sadder because now we are talking about the plants that gave us summer itself. Close your eyes and try to remember the taste of a gooseberry. If you can, you are already in a shrinking group, and if you cannot, that is exactly the point of number 7. The gooseberry bush was once as ordinary in a backyard as a garden hose. A low, unruly, viciously thorny thing, planted at the edge where it would not be brushed against, hung in early summer with hard green berries striped with pale veins, so sour when raw that biting one made a child's whole face fold in on itself. But you did not eat them raw, most of the time. You waited, and you picked them into an old ice cream tub while the thorns scratched the backs of your hands, and they went into a pie or a crumble or a pot on the stove with sugar, where the sourness turned into something bright and green and alive that no supermarket dessert has ever managed to copy. There was gooseberry fool, that simple mixture of the cooked fruit and cream, pale green and cool, the taste of a specific week in June that came once a year and then was gone. The whole plant was a lesson in patience and reward wrapped in thorns. So where did it go? Here the story turns, because the gooseberry did not just fall out of fashion. For a long stretch of the last century, it was actually difficult to grow in parts of the world because it could carry a disease that threatened pine forests, and in some places it was discouraged or even restricted. But that is only part of it. The deeper reason is the one underneath this entire list. The gooseberry gives you nothing you can grab on the way out the door. It gives you a sour berry that must be picked past thorns and cooked with care before it becomes wonderful. In a world that started measuring food by how little effort it demanded, the gooseberry never stood a chance. There was a whole culture around this thorny little bush that has gone almost completely silent. In some towns, people competed to grow the largest gooseberry, tending secret bushes and comparing their giant berries at summer shows with a seriousness that seems almost unbelievable now. That a berry most people today have never tasted was once the object of decades of quiet rivalry between neighbors. That tells you how central it was, how woven into ordinary life. A plant does not become the subject of competitions and clubs unless nearly everyone has one. And now that world is a footnote, kept alive by a handful of enthusiasts, while the bush that anchored it has vanished from the corners of a million gardens as if it had never been there at all. And yet the people who still grow one will tell you, with a slightly faraway look, that nothing tastes more like their childhood than that first tart spoonful in June. That is the strange power of these forgotten plants. They are not just food, they are keys. One taste and you are 8 years old again, in a garden that probably no longer exists, on an afternoon you did not know you would spend the rest of your life trying to get back to. Keep that feeling close, because at number 6 we move from taste to smell, and smell is the sense that reaches the deepest and oldest part of you. There is a scent that can undo 40 years in a single breath, and for a great many people that scent is blackcurrants. Number 6 on our list is the blackcurrant bush, and if you ever brushed against one on a warm day, you already know that its power is not really in the fruit. It is in the leaves. Crush one between your fingers and you release a smell so distinctive, so green and musky and sharp, that it seems to belong to a season more than to a plant. Children who grew up near one carry that smell for life, and meet it again by accident decades later and have to stop where they stand. The berries themselves were small, dark, almost black, hanging in little clusters like beads, tart enough to make you wince on their own. But cooked with sugar, they became one of the great tastes of a home summer, deep and wine dark, poured over pudding or sealed into jars of jam that glowed like garnets on a winter shelf. And there was the cordial, that thick dark syrup let down with water, the drink handed to you when you had a cold, so loaded with vitamin C that it did you real good while tasting like a treat. A single bush in the corner could supply a family all year. You almost never see one now, and the reason is quietly modern. The cordial still exists, but it comes in a bottle from a shop, and the bottle severed the drink from the plant. A whole generation grew up loving the flavor of blackcurrant while never once seeing the bush, never smelling the leaves, never staining their fingers purple picking the fruit. The taste survived as a product and the plant died out of the garden. That is a very particular kind of loss, and it happened again and again through the second half of the last century. We kept the flavors and we lost the living things that made them, and we did not notice the exchange until the bushes were already gone. Think about what that scent was actually doing, beyond delighting a child. It was marking a place as home. A person could come back to that garden after 20 years away, with the house repainted and the people gone and everything changed, and one crushed leaf would tell them, instantly and beyond any doubt, that this was the ground of their beginning. Smell bypasses all our defenses and reaches straight into the oldest rooms of memory, and the plants in an old garden were quietly building an archive of those smells, one season at a time, filing away a summer you would be able to reopen for the rest of your life. When the bushes went, that archive stopped being written. A child growing up today, surrounded by scentless lawns and sealed bottles, is accumulating far fewer of these keys, and may reach old age with almost nothing that can unlock the past in a single breath. Here is a question worth sitting with. How many of the smells that define your own childhood came from something growing, something you could have planted again and never did? The blackcurrant is not rare because it is hard. It is one of the easiest fruits there is, tough and generous and long-lived. It is rare because we forgot it was ever ours to grow. At number 5, we reach a plant that somehow hung on longer than the rest, and yet is still slipping away, one old patch at a time. Some plants outlive the people who planted them and quietly wait. Number 5 is rhubarb, and if any plant on this list deserves the word loyal, it is this one. You have probably seen it, those enormous crinkled leaves and those thick stalks blushing from green to deep red, often growing in the corner of a garden where nobody seems to tend it. That is the thing about rhubarb. It does not need you. A crown planted by a grandparent can still be pushing up stalks half a century later, long after the house has changed hands 3 times, and no one remembers who put it there. It arrives in spring like a promise kept, the first real harvest of the year when everything else is still just a hope in the soil. You pull the stalks rather than cut them, a satisfying twist and tug, and you must always remember to throw away the big leaves, which are not to be eaten. The stalks are fiercely sour raw, but stewed down with sugar they turn soft and pink and tangy, the taste of the first warm days. Rhubarb crumble, rhubarb in custard, that particular sweet sharpness that says the long gray winter is finally over. So why does a plant this tough, this forgiving, this generous still count as disappearing? Because we stopped planting new ones. The rhubarb you see is old rhubarb survivors, holdovers from a time when everyone had a patch. Almost nobody puts in a fresh crown today, and when the old houses are sold and the old gardens are paved for parking or laid to easy lawn, those decades-old crowns go into a skip. Each one that goes is not just a plant. It is a small, unbroken thread reaching back to whoever knelt down and planted it, sometime around the year you were born, expecting it to feed people they would never meet. There is something almost defiant about how easy it makes things, too, and it is worth noticing because it cuts against the excuse most people give for not growing anything. We tell ourselves we have no time, no skill, no green thumb, that plants die under our care. Rhubarb answers all of that with a shrug. You put the crown in the ground, you walk away. You come back in spring, and there it is. And it will do this again next year and the year after and long after you have forgotten it is there. It is the plant equivalent of a promise that keeps itself. If the real reason these plants disappeared was that life sped up and no one had time, rhubarb stands as the quiet rebuttal because it asks for almost none, which means its disappearance is not really about time at all. It is about attention. We did not stop planting rhubarb because we were too busy. We stopped because we stopped thinking of the yard as a place that feeds us. That is what makes rhubarb quietly moving. It is a plant that plans in decades. Whoever put in that crown was not gardening for themselves so much as for the future, for a spring they might not see. There is a whole philosophy of living hidden in that act, and we will come back to it at the very end. For now, hold this thought. The most generous plants are almost always the ones that outlast us, and we are living off the foresight of people who are gone. At number 4, that foresight becomes something close to medicine. At the edge of many an old garden, or just beyond the fence in the hedgerow, stood a small tree that gave twice a year and was treated as half plant, half remedy. Number 4 is the elder. The elderberry and few plants on this list were once so useful, and are now so completely ignored. In late spring it covered itself in great flat creamy heads of tiny flowers, and that blossom filled the warm evening air with a heavy honeyed scent that meant summer had truly arrived. Those flowers were not left to the bees alone. People picked them by the basket and turned them into elderflower cordial, that pale golden drink that tastes like the smell of June itself, and into a light sparkling wine, and dipped whole flower heads in batter to fry. Then months later, the same tree hung heavy with drooping bunches of small dark purple berries, and those went into syrup and jam and a deep red wine, and above all into a dark tonic that families reached for at the first sign of a winter cold. Long before anyone used the word immune in a marketing slogan, people were spooning elderberry syrup into children in November, and modern researchers have since taken a serious interest in why that old habit may have actually worked. So how did a tree that offered a summer drink and a winter medicine fall out of use? Partly through caution, and rightly so, because the raw berries and the rest of the plant are not to be eaten without cooking, and in an age that lost its confidence in the kitchen, that warning was enough to make people simply walk away. Partly because the medicine cabinet at the shop replaced the tree at the fence. Why simmer berries for an afternoon when a bottle promises the same thing in a spoon? And so the elder slipped from being a valued member of the household to being a weed people cut back. Its extraordinary double gift forgot inside a single lifetime. Picture the two ends of the elder's year, because together they tell you what kind of relationship people once had with a single plant. In June, a warm dusk, someone walking the garden with scissors and a basket, cutting the creamy flower heads while the scent hangs thick in the still air, thinking already of the pale cordial that will carry that exact evening into the middle of winter. Then October, the light gone thin, the same person reaching up for the heavy dark berries, simmering them slow on the stove into a syrup that will sit in the cupboard like a small insurance policy against the coughs and colds to come. One tree, two harvests, an entire quiet economy of care running through the seasons. That is what a plant could be to a household. Not a decoration you glance at, but a companion you moved through the year alongside, giving and receiving in turn. There is something almost sad in that, because the elder asked for nothing at all. It grew wild, it grew fast, it grew anywhere, and it handed over flowers in June and medicine in October to anyone who bothered to reach up. It is still out there on roadsides and field edges, blooming and fruiting for no one. The knowledge simply drained away. And that is the quiet theme tightening as we climb toward number 1. These plants did not abandon us. We walked past them until we forgot their names. At number 3, we reach a fruit so forgotten that it now sounds almost made up. Here is a fruit that will make you wonder whether an entire kind of food has been erased from memory. Number 3 is the medlar, and if you have never heard the word, you are proof of exactly how thoroughly a plant can vanish. For centuries it grew in gardens and orchards across the temperate world, a small pretty tree with big white flowers in spring, and in autumn, strange brown fruits shaped a little like large rose hips, each one with an open crown-like end that gave the fruit a face. But the medlar hid its most peculiar secret in how you ate it. Picked from the tree in autumn, it is rock hard and painfully sour, completely inedible. So you did not eat it then. You laid the fruits out somewhere cool and you waited, for weeks, while they softened and browned and turned, by a process that looks alarmingly like rotting, into something sweet. The old word for it was bledding. Once bledded, the inside became a soft spiced brown pulp that people scooped out with a spoon, tasting of apple butter and cinnamon and toffee. A strange dark sweetness eaten by the fire in the dead of the year, when almost nothing else was ripe. Now think about why a fruit like that could not survive the modern world. It cannot be sold in a shop, because a shop needs fruit that looks perfect and sells fast, and a medlar is at its best when it looks its worst. It demands patience measured in weeks and a willingness to trust a process that appears, to modern eyes, like decay. It is the exact opposite of everything a supermarket rewards. And so a fruit that fed people for 1,000 years slipped almost entirely out of existence in a couple of generations, not because it was bad, but because it refused to be fast. It is worth pausing on how old this friendship between people and the meddler really was, because it makes the speed of its loss almost shocking. Writers were mentioning this fruit hundreds of years ago. It appeared in the plays and poems people read in school. For something like 2,000 years, it was simply part of what an orchard contained, as unremarkable and expected as an apple. Generation after generation after generation knew exactly what a meddler was and precisely how to wait for it, and they passed that knowing down without ceremony, the way you pass down how to tie a shoe. And then, in the span of maybe 2 or 3 lifetimes, that unbroken chain of 2 millennia simply snapped, and now the word itself sounds invented. If a fruit that survived 2,000 years can vanish in 50, it tells you how fragile this kind of knowledge really is, and how quickly a way of living can disappear once one generation decides not to bother carrying it forward. There is a lesson tucked inside the meddler that is bigger than any recipe. It is a fruit that is only good if you wait, only sweet after a time that looks like ruin. Something in that speaks to the second half of a life, to the idea that the richest things are often the ones that come late and ask you to be patient through a stretch that feels like decline. We threw the meddler away because we lost our patience. What else have we thrown away for the same reason? Sit with that as we reach the final two, the plants that were the most beloved of all and whose absence leaves the largest hole. At number 2, the whole house used to smell of it. There was a time when a single fruit could perfume an entire home for weeks, and no one who lived with that smell ever forgot it. Number 2 is the quince, a fruit almost no one grows now and almost everyone once did. On the tree it looks like a lumpy golden pear covered in a soft gray down, and when you bring a few indoors and set them in a bowl, they slowly fill the whole house with a fragrance that is part apple, part pear, part rose, part honey. A smell so rich and strange that people used to keep quinces in a room simply to scent it, like a living candle. You cannot eat it raw. Like so much on this list, the quince demands something of you. Hard and astringent from the tree, it only reveals itself through long, slow cooking, and then it performs a small miracle. Its pale flesh, simmered for hours with sugar, turns a deep glowing rose red, sweet and perfumed and utterly unlike anything else. It became jelly the color of stained glass, and it became a thick-set paste, sliced thin and eaten with cheese, that some families made every single autumn as surely as the leaves fell. A quince tree in the corner of the garden was a promise of that ritual year after year. So why did it vanish from our yards? For all the reasons the others did, gathered into one. It asks for patience because it must be cooked long and slow. It asks for knowledge because you have to know what to do with a fruit you cannot bite into. And it gives you nothing instant, nothing you can grab and eat on the way past. In a century that fell in love with speed and convenience, the quince was quietly, thoroughly abandoned. The trees were not replaced when they died, and the recipes left the family with the grandmother who knew them. And there was a generosity built into the quince that we have almost entirely forgotten, because it was so much more than a household could use. A single mature tree gave far more fruit than any one family could ever cook, and so the quince became a plan of giving away, of the bowl of golden fruit left on a neighbor's step to scent their home to, of the jars of rose-colored jelly handed across fences at the start of winter. It knitted a street together in a small, fragrant way. The surplus was the point. In a garden built to feed people, abundance was not a problem to be managed but a gift to be shared, and the plants that overflowed were loved precisely because they gave you a reason to knock on a door. We have replaced that overflow with the exact amount, bought and paid for, and we knock on far fewer doors than we used to. And yet consider what we gave up. Not just a fruit, but a smell that filled a home, a color that felt like alchemy, an autumn ritual that gathered a family around a pot on the stove. The quince was never really about eating. It was about the weeks of fragrance, the transformation, the sense that the season had a taste and a smell and a ceremony all its own. That is a great deal to lose, and most people lost it without ever knowing it was there to keep. Which brings us, at last, to number 1, the plant that stood in more backyards than any other on this list, and whose loss is the one you can feel even if you cannot name it. I told you at the start to keep one plant in the back of your mind, and here it is. Number one is the backyard grape arbor. Picture it, because a great many of you are about to remember it. A simple wooden frame over a path or a patio, a gnarled old vine trained across the top, and by high summer a green roof of broad leaves heavy with hanging bunches of grapes, throwing a cool, dappled shade over the one place the whole family gathered when the day cooled down. It was not a vineyard. It was a room made of leaves, and almost every street had one. The grapes were usually the tough-skinned, deeply perfumed kind, the sort you squeezed so the sweet inside slipped into your mouth and you spat out the skin, intensely flavored in a way that store grapes, bred to be seedless and to travel, simply are not. They went into juice, into jelly, sometimes into a rough homemade wine in the shed. But the fruit was almost the smaller gift. The greater gift was the arbor itself, the shade it made, the way it turned a plain back step into the heart of the house for 3 months of the year. People sat under it in the evening. Children played beneath it. Meals happened there. The vine held the summer together. So how did the thing that shaded a nation's backyards nearly disappear? Slowly, and then all at once. A vine takes a few years to establish, and it needs a little pruning each winter, a small yearly act of care, and as life sped up, that small act was one of the first to go. Patios were poured for furniture instead of planted with a vine. Yards shrank. Air conditioning pulled families indoors, and the cool leafy room outside was no longer needed, so it was no longer built. And here is the quiet heart of it. The arbor was never really about the grapes at all. It was about sitting together in the shade at the end of a warm day, and when we stopped doing that, the vine that made it possible had nothing left to hold up. Think about the particular quality of the light under an arbor, because that is the detail people remember most, even when they have forgotten the fruit entirely. It was green and moving and cool, the sun broken into 100 shifting coins on the ground, the heat of the day softened into something you could sit inside. Nobody builds that light anymore. We have patios open to the hard glare, and umbrellas we fold away, and rooms sealed and chilled behind glass. But the living shade of a vine grown thick overhead is a specific kind of comfort that a whole generation is growing up never having felt. And it cost almost nothing. A few years of patience, a little pruning each winter, and any ordinary family could have a ceiling of leaves and a room of green light for the price of paying attention. We decided that was too much to ask, and we have been a little more indoors and a little more apart ever since. That is why number one is the grape arbor and not something rarer or stranger, because its loss is not really about a fruit we no longer taste. It is about a place we no longer make, an evening we no longer spend, a way of being together that quietly folded up and was carried indoors. Offer a child today a warm grape pulled from a vine over their own back step, and they would not know what it was, and that is not the child's fault. It is ours. We took down the room made of leaves and did not build another. And with that, the countdown is done, and only one question is left, the one every plant on this list has been asking. So here is the question, standing again where we started, in that tidy modern backyard with its rectangle of grass and its few forgotten pots. How did all of them go at almost the same time in the space of a single generation? Nasturtiums and horseradish and gooseberries and blackcurrants, rhubarb and elder and medlar and quince, and the grape arbor over the back step. Not one of them was hard to grow. Most of them were the easiest plants a garden ever held. They did not fail us. We walked away from them. You may notice that the losses grew heavier as we climbed. We began with a flower a child could eat and ended with a whole way of spending a summer evening. That was not an accident of ordering. It is the shape of the thing itself. When a garden empties out, you lose the small pleasures first, the peppery leaf, the sour berry, and you barely feel it. What you do not notice is that the same emptying is slowly taking the large things too, the shade, the gathering, the sense that the ground around your home is alive and working on your behalf. By the time you feel that loss, the arbor is already down. And now you know why, because you felt the same reason repeat through every single one. They asked for patience, and we ran out of it. They asked for a little knowledge passed hand to hand, and the hands let go. They gave nothing instant, nothing you could grab on the way out the door, and we began to measure everything by exactly that. The shop had the flavor in a bottle and the medicine in a box and the fruit in a plastic tray, and one plant at a time we accepted the trade. We kept the tastes and lost the living things. We kept the lawn and lost the larder. We poured the patio and took down the room made of leaves. But here is the part that should lift you rather than sadden you, and it is the reason this list is worth knowing. Every one of these plants is still available. Not one is truly extinct. The gooseberry, the quince, the elder, the vine over the arbor, all of them can still be planted this year by anyone who decides to. The knowledge that drained away can be picked back up by a single person who cares enough to try. That grandparent who planted a rhubarb crown for a spring they might never see was not doing something rare or heroic. They were simply refusing to let the thread break. And that refusal is available to you too, in a corner of a yard, on an afternoon you choose. And you do not have to plant all 10 or even 5 to undo a little of this. You only have to plant one gooseberry bush by a fence, one rhubarb crown in a forgotten corner, one quince tree that will, in a few years, fill a room with a smell your grandchildren will still be able to summon when they are old. The whole quiet erosion this list describes happened one plant at a time, one skip spring at a time, one person deciding not to bother. It can be reversed exactly the same way, one plant and one person and one spring at a time. There is nothing grand required. The people who kept these gardens were not experts or idealists. They were ordinary people who simply had not yet been talked out of growing their own food and shade and medicine, and you can simply decide not to be talked out of it either. Maybe that is the real gift hidden in a list of forgotten plants. Not nostalgia, which only aches, but an invitation which acts. You cannot get your childhood garden back, but you can plant the vine and wait the few slow years, and one warm evening a decade from now you can sit in the shade of a room made of leaves that did not exist until you decided it should. The plants were never the thing we lost. What we lost was the patience to grow slow things for people who come after us. And that, unlike the grape arbor, you can put back in the ground tomorrow. The garden was never really about the plants. It was about who we became while we waited for them to grow.